The Juneau World Affairs Council, in collaboration with KTOO, presents the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. In this lecture, The Role of Religion in the Ideology of Authoritarian Movements, Dr. Mark Silk discusses how religion plays a wide variety of roles in the ideology of authoritarian movements and is used by them before and after they come to power.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I really want to thank the Public Affairs Council for its invitation. Among other things, it's allowed me to perform an act of filial piety. Since my father was stationed in Alaska during World War II, and the place has occupied via his stories a place in my mental world since childhood, and now finally I've gotten here after having set foot in 49 other states of them. The hospitality has been wonderful. I do have to say, however, that the weather I left in Connecticut is a little better than it is in Juneau, but I wasn't brought here under false pretenses as to the weather. This is going to be something a little different from what we've heard so far. I hope that's not amiss. I want to begin by saying a few words about the way authoritarian movements sacralize politics ideologically. And by ideologically, I mean not only through language, but also through the symbolic forms that they use to define and describe themselves, often photographic. Here it's important to recognize, and I do want to stress this, that sacralization, making sacred, is a normal feature of modern nation states, whether they're authoritarian or not, and nowhere more so than in the United States. We have a range of texts and institutions and places that we regard as sacred. The Declaration of Independence, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. If we consider the Lincoln Memorial, it's a temple built on the inspiration of Athens, the temple in Athens to the goddess Athena, and not by accident. And sites connected to wars, battlefields like Gettysburg, I know Jaren's just been there, sites like Valley Forge, and above all the ceremonies and shrines, the cemeteries, and shrines to those who have died for the country. These are our sites of our civil religion. Foremost among the latter of the cemeteries is of course Arlington. There are a couple of photos of Arlington National Cemetery, and this kind of sacralization we have come to call, or academics have come to call, civil religion, in our case, the American civil religion. The Italian scholar, Emilio Gentile, defines it like this. I put it up here. It's a little small there. I'll read it. Civil religion, he writes, is the conceptual category that contains the forms of sacralization of a political system that guarantee a plurality of ideas, free competition in the exercise of power, and the ability of the governed to dismiss their governments through peaceful and constitutional methods. Civil religion therefore respects individual freedom, coexists with other ideologies, and does not impose obligatory and unconditional support for its commandments. A key aspect of civil religion on this kind of definition is that it serves to include all citizens, which is to say those with different views, including political and religious ones. This was an issue that really engaged the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who built on the concept and coined the term civil religion in his social contract. And it explains this concept, why there are, for example, rules barring partisan political activity in U.S. military cemeteries. There we have Donald Trump, who is widely regarded as having violated those rules last August when he visited Arlington with family members of military personnel who were killed during the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan 3 years ago. The meaning of that violation in terms of American civil religion was captured in the headline on a subsequent column by USA Today's Marla Bautista, which ran, "Trump's appalling desecration of Arlington National Cemetery shows he still can't be trusted," unquote. Well, only something that's sacred can be desecrated. Gentile opposes this idea of civil religion to what he calls political religion. And here's a quote on that, and that will be the last extended quote I will inflict on you this afternoon. "Political religion is the sacralization of a political system founded on an unchallengeable monopoly of power, ideological monism," skipped back. "Ideological monism and the obligatory and unconditional subordination of the individual and the collectivity to its code of commandments. Consequently, a political religion is intolerant, invasive, and fundamentalist, and it wishes to permeate every aspect of an individual's life and of a society's collective life." As perhaps our leading historian of fascist Italy, Gentile is primarily interested in the expressly secular totalitarian regimes of the middle of the 20th century. He argues that fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Russia all created their own political religions. Unsurprisingly, these secular religions were to some extent modeled on the religious beliefs and forms prevalent in those countries. For example, Roman Catholicism in the case of Italy. They had in common, just to pick one element, the creation of a cult, a kind of divine standing for their leader, a species of deification conveyed in what are literally iconic images. Here are a few. There's Mussolini's most famous one, repeatedly on the wall in Florence. There is Hitler in an oil painting like a medieval knight. And there's a march in Berlin in '51 with everyone holding up signs of Stalin shortly before his death. We can also see this in sort of comparable political religions of a later time. There's, say, the cult of Mao Zedong, and North Koreans Kim Il-sung. And just for the heck of it, I thought I would throw in as well a kind of posthumous cult of Hugo Chavez on his way to heaven there on the right. This kind of cult of personality is a feature of political religions. And there are others as well, but I don't want to spend time just on theoretical formulations, or we're almost done with that. It is important to understand these formulations, civil religion, political religion, as ideal types. A civil religion can have aspects of a political religion or can move in the direction of one. An example in this country might be, or was, with the onset of the Cold War, the American civil religion was constructed so as to exclude communists. That's a violation of the principle of inclusivity, but in the Cold War that was deemed to be okay, and it was marked by, for example, in 1954, the addition of the words under God to the Pledge of Allegiance, specifically designed, explicitly said to be designed to differentiate the U.S. from the Soviet Union and its godless supporters. Likewise, in the mid-50s, "In God We Trust" was placed on postage stamps and all U.S. currency and made the national motto to boot, no longer "E pluribus unum." And a quintessential expression of that sort of moment in American civil religion is, I don't know how many people have visited the Air Force Academy Chapel? At least one. It's a famous thing. It was set up built in 1959. It is in form a kind of militarized or, sort of Air Force version of a Christian church, an apparent expression for its time of kind of political religion, but it's very much an expression of the civil religion of the times, in that it includes within its space separate Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chapels in the Protestant, Catholic, Jewish inclusive formula of its day. So this might be contrasted with the main cathedral of the Russian military, which was consecrated in 2021, just a few years ago. It is a Russian Orthodox church with no nod towards religious inclusion in a country that is only 40% Russian Orthodox, probably nominally so, since very few people go to church in Russia these days. And where less than half the citizens consider themselves Christians of any sort. Here's a mosaic from inside that shows Soviet military heroes of World War II down below, and above are representations of a kind of linkage of church and state in pre-modern Russia, figures that, and I'm engaging in a little bit of guesswork here. I did consult with our expert on Russia earlier today, but I think we've got on the right the patron saints of the missionaries to the Slavs, Cyril and Methodius, and perhaps the other figures are Vladimir the Great and Alexander Nevsky, medieval rulers and defenders of the faith, who are also sainted. So the idea, of course, of the Soviet state, anti or religious, being sort of the perpetrator, the conductor of World War II, is a little bit odd. There was a moment when somebody proposed including Stalin in a mosaic in this church that was considered to be a bridge too far. But there was a kind of entente between church and state in the middle of the war in 1943, when Stalin and Metropolitan Alexius of the Russian Orthodox Church sort of came to an agreement, and orthodoxy, after having been suppressed for 2 decades, was allowed to start to open churches, those that still were around. The history of this, I think the point of this exercise is to say that in the current iteration of Russia, Vladimir Putin has linked church and state in a tradition that really goes back to the linkage of the Byzantine Empire. Western historians have tended to use the word Caesaropapism to describe it. I think that's a somewhat contested term. In Greek and in Russian, the term for such mutual cooperation of church and state is symphonia, symphony. And in line with this concept, Russian Patriarch Kirill, there he is, and there's Putin looking on. He's described Putin's rule as a miracle of God. And in line with Putin's own revival of Russian imperialist ambitions, Kirill himself has attempted to play a role in an international effort to advance conservative social values. I won't spend time on this, but it really helps explain why people, American evangelical leaders, some of them have such a warm feeling in their heart for Putin, because at least up until the invasion of Crimea, they were really working hand in glove with the Russian Orthodox Church as sort of allies in a war against liberal permissiveness, one might say. It's in the Russian Orthodox context a kind of Orthodox version or reinvention of the old Soviet Comintern, one might say. That's not entirely an inside joke. I would say that a kind of mini-me version of Putin's religious authoritarianism can be found in Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Whoops. We skipped to Erdogan. Now let's see. There he is. I think I got the slide out of order. There's Orban receiving the Serbian religious gold degree of the Order of Saint Sava, whatever that is exactly, and being praised by the Serbian Orthodox Patriarch for defending Christianity. Orban fights for the soul of Europe, the Patriarch said, and the Prime Minister, Orban, replied, "We are a peaceful people, we want peace, but there is indeed a war for the soul of Europe, and without Christian unity, including Orthodoxy, we cannot win this battle." Orban's own religious background, which is a kind of murky in the way that some Republican politicians' religious background is murky in our country, but it seems to be Protestant. But anyway, this is a kind of generic Christianity that he claims to be defending. I'll come back to by the slides to Erdogan, because in some ways this kind of use of religion by authoritarian figures, by Putin and Orban, can seem a little bit like Erdogan's own incorporation of Islam into his regime. Here he is seen praying at Hagia Sophia, which is the 6th century cathedral of Constantinople, built by the Emperor Justinian, that was turned into a mosque by the Ottomans when they conquered, after they conquered Constantinople, making it Istanbul in the 15th century. And then in 1934 was turned into a museum by Ataturk, who was about the business of suppressing the role of Islam in his Turkish state. But 4 years ago was made back into a mosque by Erdogan. So, you can see in these sort of manifestations of big religious buildings and how authoritarian rulers use them, a kind of parallel. But I think there's an important difference here, and it's not only that Erdogan seems to be personally somewhat religious, whereas Putin and Orban, I think, not so much. But Putin and Orban have no, I think, significant religious grassroots constituency in their countries. I mean, just people don't go to church, particularly in Russia. Even compared to Ukraine, it's not very church-going. I think the Hungarians are not very religious. So there's a different project going on, and they're wrapping themselves in religion, rebuilding a kind of post-communist ideology, and in the case of Hungary, resisting immigration from Muslim countries into Europe. That's what we're defending Christian, even if it's non-observant Christian society in Europe from, allegedly. And of course, the pluralistic liberal culture of Western Europe and beyond. How religious the Erdogan case really raises the issue of how religious constituencies themselves function with respect to authoritarian regimes. And that depends, of course, on how they regard those regimes and vice versa. I'm going to take a moment to just, before I get to that, to just show you a painting by actually a member of the painter who belongs to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that is Mormon. And this is a kind of manifestation of what could be called religious nationalism in America. If you look closely, and it may be hard for you to see, there is, of course, Jesus Christ in the middle with a copy of the Constitution. Behind him are all of the, we might say, saints of American history. At the lower left are the good American citizens who are going to heaven. And on the right are like the professors and journalists and politicians who are not. This is a piece of art based on paintings like this by Giotto, The Last Judgment, where you'll see Jesus in the middle, the saints behind, the people who are going to heaven on the lower left, and Satan and all of the people going to hell on the lower right. McNaughton is a painter who very much grounds his painting in previous iconographic forms. So to return to what I was saying, the question of religious constituencies is important in understanding how authoritarian regimes put together their ideologies or how they construe their public as they do that. Here is a mass demonstration of Iranians against the Shah of Iran, whose own sort of religious form or political religion seemed to be in some way trying to hark back to the glory days of pre-Islamic Persia. And the Shiite majority in the country, or conservative Shiites, did not like that, did not like him, holding up posters of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who after then the revolution was able to have people here, residents of Tehran, holding his image and marching in support. Khomeini's regime, and the subsequent to this day, I mean, it's been since 1979, is based on the rule or the supreme authority of Shiite legal scholars, what is known as the vilayat-i faqih, if my Persian is not so good. But that's a kind of theological innovation, and it serves as the ideological basis for a theocratic political religion. A different kind of switching sides, as we think about religious constituency, is in this century in Myanmar, a country where religious authority resides in the community of Buddhist monks. In 2007, here's a protest by monks, and what you're seeing with that monk in the front is he's holding a begging bowl upside down over his head. The way in which political legitimacy is acquired in traditional Burmese society is by providing alms to the monks. And in return, political authority descends. It's a kind of transactional deal. By turning over the bowls, symbolically indicating this, by refusing to take military alms, the monks have acted to deny political authority, merit to the authorities. And in fact, this was extremely powerful protest, and the military regime within a few years backs off. I will spare you the details. It's a fairly intricate and complicated story, but the point is, in due course, the military returns to power through a coup against the interim arrangement, and through really a genocidal campaign of removing the Rohingya Muslims from their country in the name of Buddhism. And there you have activist Buddhist monks, anti-Muslim Buddhist monks, leading the way ideologically for the Burmese regime. So religion's a complicated factor for authoritarian regimes, and it can operate in different ways, and it's one of the reasons, I think, why authoritarian leaders are careful about how they manage the sacralization of their regimes and how they deal with the religion that's on the ground. Staying sort of in this part of the world, if we think about India these days, and in some ways it's the foremost example of use of religion in the ideology of an authoritarian ruler, hostility to, we'll get to this particular image in a second, but hostility to Islam has played, I think, a very significant role in the success of the Hindu political religion advanced by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This ideology called Hindutva has been around for decades. It's a long-standing one. The BJP is a movement that has been around for a long time. In a way, one might say, well, you know, it was a minority. It was a minority report in India for many years, but has come to dominate India in recent years, thanks to the very clever politics of Modi. It is quite clearly a political religion in Gentile's sense, creating a post-secular religious ideology that builds on long-standing hostility to Muslims in India. You think about the creation of the Indian state, which resulted in the separation of India from Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh. Here, Modi himself, because of his leadership and I mean, it's important, you know, even if for Modi, Hinduism is a kind of not only a national ideology, but he sought in various ways to advance it as a national sort of mode of salvation in various ways. You know, yoga as something for everyone, talking about in sort of, you know, in untrue ways, but about how Hinduism has always been green, even though India is not a particularly green country in terms of political, in terms of public policy. But this has been central to Modi's ideology, and in return, at a popular level, he has been a figure sometimes venerated. Of course, in the context of Hinduism, there are many figures that are venerated in some polytheistic context. This itself is a statue that was created for a temple that was to be built in honor of him, but he said no, that was nothing he was going to go for. It was never built. But it is an emblem of the way in which a particular political move by an authoritarian ruler can have, profound resonance in the public. And Modi has played this up. Perhaps the most sort of controversial and one of the more troubling sort of instances of religious activity or behavior in India, at least, was the I don't know what happened to this slide. Goodness, it's a great slide. It seems to have, I don't know what happened. But it is anyway, I'll have to describe what it was. It's Modi worshiping at the Hindu temple in Ayodhya, which was allowed to be built on the site of a mosque that was destroyed by a Hindu mob that had been set in place by the BJP in 1991, 92. And so finally the Indian Supreme Court allowed this temple to Rama to be built, and Modi himself showed up to be among the worshipers when the temple was consecrated. So that use of religion is something that, maybe Modi was not prepared to be venerated himself in a temple, but certainly leading the way as the head of a Hindu nationalist party. In some ways, I think that the term Christian nationalism, which I'll get to in a second, derives from the use that's been very common and appropriate of Hindu nationalism, which has been the feature of India for, I know, of course, in America, we only invent our own terms. We never borrow them from anyone else. But it can happen. All right. Now, perhaps related to veneration of a political figure is the praying over a chosen authoritarian leader so as to endow him or her with spiritual power. There's an example from Brazil of a couple of years ago when Bolsonaro was running for re-election, a re-election he did not win. But Brazilian evangelicals, and really evangelicals in Berlin in Brazil are charismatic Christians, were a base of political support for Bolsonaro, and that's an image I particularly wanted to include because it bears some resemblance to this image, which you may have seen before, or a version of it. A comparable group of evangelicals who met it with some regularity, I guess, with Donald Trump when he was president. I don't want to go into great detail about this, but that's familiar. And Trump's own eagerness to kind of associate himself or make himself be a defender of religion is, I need not even hardly mention that. Here's an even more famous image that you'll know. There he is defending an Episcopal church during the Washington protests after the killing of George Floyd, holding up a Bible and brandishing it, I guess you might say. It's been, it's of a piece. As Patriarch Kirill has celebrated Putin, so Trump's main spiritual advisor, at least in his first term, the Pentecostal pastor Paula White, praised him as being chosen by God to protect religious values, an Orban, a Putin, that kind of person. I can't resist showing you another painting by this John McNaughton, you know, based on the famous photograph of the laying on of hands by, and you've got, you know, Ronald Reagan and various other presidents, and since there was a black guy, as you can see over there, we don't know who he is, but so there had to be a black guy in this painting. There's Frederick Douglass, or, you know, a couple. Anyway, that, you know, that what I would call your attention to there is like so on the Resolute desk in front of Trump, there's of course the Bible on our right, and I presume the Constitution in the middle, and you see all those keys there? I suspect strongly that what McNaughton had in mind was Matthew 16:19, where Jesus tells St. Peter, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So that gets you far along into the sort of political religion or Christian nationalist imagery that is floating around this country these days. So I want to sort of wrap up a bit by thinking about, and I realize this is you know, international affairs, but it's important to recognize that what we're experiencing here at the far end, whether it's embrace of Putin or the what I'm just about to talk about, there are international dimensions of this movement which should not be ignored. They're very much part and parcel of the worlds of the people who are advancing this kind of agenda. This is obviously, there's Jesus with a MAGA hat from January 6, 2021, which was an event, the Capitol riot was an event really suffused with religion, although that was underreported in the press, initially at any rate. Here's another image from there. And it's important to, well, what I want to talk about briefly is based on, I mean, the whole study of Christian nationalism these days has become a kind of cottage industry. And so I'd like to say a few words based on a book I just read. It's one of that industry's most recent productions by a guy named Matthew Taylor, who works for an organization, an interfaith organization in Baltimore. The book's titled The Violent Take It by Force, and it focuses on a movement that some of you may have heard of by now called the New Apostolic Reformation, known to some of its adherents as the NAR. And the book focuses on its role on January 6th. The movement itself comes out of the world of independent charismatic churches and features a number of prominent religious figures that most of us outside of this subculture haven't heard of. For this audience, however, it may be unnecessary to note that Sarah Palin comes out of this religious world. And the NAR's most sort of famous icon these days, which appeared at January 6th, is the Appeal to Heaven flag, which some people noticed existed outside of now Speaker Johnson's office before he became Speaker of the House. It's a flag that takes up a phrase used by the philosopher John Locke to justify revolution against political authorities. There's always this problem that Christians have, thanks to St. Paul's letter to the Romans. We sort of say obey the political authorities, and if for some reason you don't feel like obeying them, you need to have some larger justification. Why Mike Johnson had the flag outside his office before becoming Speaker is something we can speculate on. But the NAR's ideology is often considered Christian nationalism, but I think that Matt Taylor has it right in referring to it as Christian supremacy. It's an ideology summed up in a kind of televangelist named Lance Wellnau phrase or concept as the Seven Mountains Mandate, which holds that Christians should ascend to the domination of 7 so-called mountains of culture: family, religion, education, media, arts, and entertainment, business, and government. As Taylor puts it in describing one of the movement's leaders, while he, quote, speaks the language of democracy and justice and constitutional rights, his ultimate vision is a retrenchment from democracy in the church and society. Now, I don't want to suggest that this ideology is in any straightforward way the ideology of the MAGA movement, if movement is even the right word to describe the devotees of that slogan, or the wearers of the hats. There's no question, however, that NAR ideas have spread through the MAGA world and form an ideology that is, in part discernible in the now notorious Project 2025, for example. As for, the would-be authoritarian leader himself, Donald Trump, it's anything but clear that he knows or grasps this ideology. But like other authoritarian leaders, he's driven inexorably towards the exclusivism of a political religion. What he says, that Catholics and Jews, everybody has, should have their head examined if they don't vote for him. I mean, that is not exactly a pluralist political position. And this NAR ideology is the sort of ideology of a political religion that currently lies at hand. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and take some questions.
Very fascinating. One thing that strikes me is that we focus mostly on how authoritarians make use of religion. But I'm struck that in many respects it's a symbiotic relationship, which is to say we have religion that wants to take advantage of authoritarians. And what comes to mind are the Concordats, Hitler, before that Mussolini. I think about another example, I think, in the that image you had, the Church of Jesus Christ, legitimizing itself as an American religion, as it were, and having that need, but also then reflecting the church I grew up in. The American flag was always part and parcel of what was in front of the church. And so maybe some comment about the interests that religion has in participating in authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that has always drawn me to the study of religion and, makes it so endlessly fascinating is that, it isn't a thing. It's a lot of different things, and people come from a lot of different places, and particular religious traditions can change a lot. I mean, once upon a time, Baptists in America were the most strict separationists in terms of separation of church and state, of any religious community, you know, in world history. I mean, they didn't want the state of Connecticut to tax them, you know, to take their own taxes and return it to them so that they could keep the roofs on their churches. I mean, you know, it just was not on call. On the other hand, you have very strong traditions of, you know, just to stick within Christianity, of church-state amalgamation, or there was certainly when after Constantine, Emperor Constantine converts at the beginning of the 4th century, and then over the course of that century, paganism is more or less outlawed, and all other religions are kind of suppressed with the slight exception of Judaism. I mean, the church leaders thought that, you know, they had it made, and yet at the same time, at least in the West, in the history of the Middle Ages, the church and various state people are at loggerheads. So the question is complicated, but I think when religious leaders of a certain kind see the opportunity to pursue their agenda with the help of the state, you know, assuming their agenda is not just political, which I assume, in large part. I mean, in the 19th century, so, you know, relatively recently, the Catholic Church took the position coming out of the First Vatican Council that you know, separation of church and state was not good, and that the American system was not the ideal one, and the ideal system, because it was going to lead to, you know, a lot of people not getting saved who could get saved. And outside the church, there's no salvation. You know, I mean, the traditional position is like, you know, sure, we want the state to, we may even believe that individual conscience should have its right, that we're not interested in forcible conversion. But at the same time, if you've got the public authorities putting their thumb on the scale on behalf of truth, yeah, of course we want that. And to that degree, I think there's always going to be some temptation in that direction, and why shouldn't there be? I mean, if that's where you're coming from. Hey, Bill.
Mark, thank you again. You and I spent a full minute this morning talking about a talisman I carry with me wherever I go on the planet.
Correct.
It's a World War.
Gott mit uns.
Gott mit uns. Yeah, God is on our side. God is with us. This is a World War I German Army belt buckle. 8 million German men wore this thing during World War I. So my questions to you, could you help us understand whether this is a metaphor for the human condition, whereby every one of us, humans, more or less, believes that we are members of a special species, God's favorite, and therefore God won't let us fail, and therefore we don't need to worry about climate change and other things like that. And secondly, isn't the whole human enterprise, the whole human species, an authoritarian movement?
I feel inclined to take a pass on the second question. I mean, we all want, you know, we would like, I mean, I think, you know, if Jaron thinks we all ought to live, and I guess we'll talk about this tomorrow, we all ought to want to be in a free society. It means we all want to be our own authorities. I'm not sure that that's true, incidentally, but there it is. As far as the position of God, you know, God with us, that we walk around with a sense that God's on our side. You know, in the American tradition, the best riposte to that is Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he goes, and before he gives it, he writes to a friend, you know, people aren't going to like this, what I have to say, but I got to say it. And what he says is, you know, both sides worship the same God. In fact, said they were right. Both could not be rewarded. Both have to pay the price for slavery, no matter what it takes. And, you know, I think of all the presidents in history, and I don't think this is a unique position of mine, you know, Lincoln is considered the deepest thinker and the most serious, you know, person in terms of really trying to work through these complicated questions. I think there's a strong tradition in among not just, you know, sort of sophisticated theologians, but ordinary people that know, you know, we want to be on God's side, but I'm not going to be so presumptuous as to say God's on my side. I will work to try to be there. I mean, now that's not to say when we have strong positions, and I'm sure, you know, whether you were, you know, if you were anti-slavery once upon a time, I'm sure in the pro-life movement today, the conviction that, you know, God is on our side on this issue is very powerful indeed. So maybe that's the way to see it. On an issue-by-issue basis, yeah, we think we're doing God's work if we're doing this or that or on one side, and we end up at loggerheads in ways that don't make for such easy politics. Personally, I would be reluctant to say that, you know, that there is some kind of general, you know, that people tend to feel, oh yeah, God's with me. But, you know, what do I know? We'll do a poll. Please.
Thank you for coming to talk to us. And I have a question, if you could speak about Guatemala during the time of what some people call the Civil War, which was a genocide of the indigenous people, and Rios Montt, who was a de facto president or military leader at that time, who invited the wide open, welcoming doors to the evangelicals. So I've seen a lot of churches throughout the country. Thank you.
I don't pretend to be, I mean, Maria should talk about Guatemala, she's a neighbor, but what I'd say, the best I can do in response is yes, evangelicals have proven to be, at least among some of them, good allies of authoritarian leaders in a number of countries in Latin America, dealing with an established Catholic Church that they despised or, you know, were in competition with, and seeing an opportunity to move. You know, there was Hugo Chavez sometimes played footsie with evangelicals in Venezuela, the way Bolsonaro and much more recently in Brazil. So I think, you know, one of the issues that one could talk about in this context, and I certainly didn't, is how these kinds of alliances between religious leaders, let's say, and authoritarian leaders relates to competition among religious groups. Where do we, you know, can we get in? You certainly see, you know, that kind of thing that has taken place in the context of, you know, in Russia, where, you know, you don't want to be a Jehovah's Witness. You know, you're fine if you're Russian Orthodox, but if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you know, you're going to be thrown in prison. So I think the kind of thing with Rios Montt in Guatemala needs to be sort of seen in that broader context. But anything more specific, I will yield. I need to defer to somebody who knows Guatemala. All right. Thank you. Oh, one more, Jaron, quickly, because we have a minute.
Well, since you invoked my name, I just have to come up here.
In vain or not?
Hope not in vain. So I was very intrigued, especially with the panel coming up tomorrow, of your comment about that seemed to equate living in a free society, individualistic society, with everyone being their own authority. Did I understand that correctly? And if you have time, could you comment on that or expand on that just a little bit?
maybe we should leave that for the panel tomorrow. But I think we have ample opportunity to talk about that then. I do think that what one can see in a free society is people who don't want to be their own authority and move in the direction of smaller groups that can provide that. And we see that in American religious history and elsewhere. But let's talk about that tomorrow. Thank you all.
That was Dr. Mark Silk discussing the role of religion in the ideology of authoritarian movements. It was recorded October 18, 2024 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit Ani as part of the 2024 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Political Authoritarianism on the Rise in the 21st Century. Produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine,